I declare the meeting open, and I bid you, Mr. Pedro Goulart, most heartily welcome. You may now give a brief exposition of your research, your reasons for having undertaken it, and the results it has yielded.
Mr. Rector Magnificus, Rector of ISS, examiners, ISS staff, fellow students, and friends. This afternoon, I will present my thesis on essays on schooling and child labor in Portugal. Throughout the presentation, slides with graphs or statements of recent child workers will be shown to exemplify my work. I will begin by narrating my personal experience and interest in doing this research. 22 years ago, when I was in the 6th grade, I used to walk every day from this school in the center of Lisbon with George. In our class picture, you can see both of us in the front row. In many ways we were similar, yet different too. We were peaceful and discreet compared to the generally macho nature of boys in Portugal, and got along well. However, I was a single child from a middle-class family, while George lived in a nearby slum and came from a large household. Our results in school were also quite different. He got low grades, and he had already failed more than once, I think. Even his promotion in school the previous year had relied on his good behavior. From time to time, his father would take him to work in construction. I can clearly recall his stints at work, and his calloused hands, so different from most of us. He was still in school compared to many of his neighbors who had already dropped out, but unfortunately, he too left before the end of the school year. Later on, I progressed to the 7th grade and changed schools. By chance, a year or two later, I met George on my way to school. We laughed as we met and updated each other on our young lives. He had registered again in our old school to finish grade 6. This was probably the only time I met him in the 6 years I was at my new school, which was actually located close to his place. It was as if we lived in different worlds. Many years later, after I had concluded my master's in the Netherlands, we met again. He told me he had a daughter, that he was working in a butcher shop and played soccer in his spare time. I suggested that completing 9th grade may be handy, but he politely said his job was pretty good and that he was happy with it. We exchanged phone numbers for a promised get-together. However, things got busy and I delayed the phone call. Several months later, when I finally called, I got a cranky George on the line. As I tried to chat, he started questioning why I had called. Eventually, I understood that he had lost his job. The conversation continued in a somewhat aggressive manner, and after that, well, we both went back to our lives. This true story, narrated here, depicts some of the key features highlighted by this thesis. While much of the child labor and schooling debate in development studies focuses on developing countries, there are developed countries that still struggle with the issue of working children and low educational outcomes. Now considered a developed country, Portugal still strives to catch up these countries in terms of educational outcomes and reducing child labor. The relatively high rate of Portugal's illiteracy in Europe makes it the favorite country for neuropsychologists studying the effect of illiteracy in the brain. Additionally, 48% of the population suffer from functional illiteracy, that is, they do not understand what they read and write. Despite considerable progress among the younger generation, Portugal still lags behind Europe in education in quantity and quality. For instance, average achievement scores at different subjects of Portuguese students are also lower compared to most other European countries, which has even led the country to withdraw from TIMSS International Comparative Survey. As for child labor, in spite of a decline in its incidence during the 20th century, it has been in the spotlight. In 1998, after national and international pressure, a unique program in the developed world was designed to tackle child labor in Portugal. The latest figures, though from 2001, suggest from about 8 to 12% of children aged 6 to 15 could be classified as working. In societies where schooling has become essential, the challenges and risks of social and labor market exclusion may be higher than in developing countries. The ones who do not reach a minimum threshold of competencies will have limited access to labor markets. Early entry into the workforce and or failing at school means not only foregone education, but also an unprepared labor force, particularly when few or none of the tasks done by children will contribute to their future labor market skills. For these Portuguese children and youth, lack of education is a handicap for the rest of their lives, leading to lower skilled, lower paid jobs or even unemployment that will tend to perpetuate their underprivileged status. Given these motivations, the thesis bridges the topic on Portugal in 3 essays, using a multidisciplinary approach. The first essay provides historical perspective on schooling and child labor. The second one focuses on present-day child labor and its consequences. Finally, the third essay addresses the determinants of school success and the role of psychological variables such as interest in school. I will now proceed to discuss each in more detail. The first essay provides a historical perspective. It examines the evolution of schooling and particularly child labor since the end of the 19th century and identifies the major forces that have driven the process. The Portuguese experience is set against the backdrop of the country's economic structure and economic growth, demographic changes, educational expansion, schooling and labor legislation, and changing norms espoused by its elites. The essay is based both on qualitative and quantitative sources of information. That is, reports by education and labor inspectors, conference and parliamentary proceedings on one hand, and industrial, labor and household surveys on the other hand. On the educational front, the massification of education and the enforcement of compulsory education laws are historically a recent phenomenon. Portugal achieved universal first grade enrollment only in the late 70s and almost universal sixth grade enrollment in the 90s. Nevertheless, child labor evolution had its own pace. Child labor was widespread up to the mid-20th century, when more than 60% of children aged 10 to 14 worked. As you can see in Figure 1, there is a decline in child labor since 1945, but with periods of acceleration and slowing down. My research findings suggest that while legal steps may help reduce child labor, these do not appear to be the key determinants in the Portuguese experience. For example, when the minimum working age law was increased to 14 years in 1969, child labor had already decreased by half. Instead, I argue that it was the major structural change towards the modern agricultural and non-agricultural sector through technical and technological change that led to the decline in child labor. Figure 2 provides additional evidence as increased labor inspection reduced child labor in a formal environment, but not child labor in family firms or within the family from 1998 to 2001. The use of children in the labor market appears to have been driven mainly by the needs of the economic structure of the country, which in turn may be reflected in the norms and values espoused by its political leaders, and their willingness to pass and implement legal measures. The acceleration of the decline in the 80s is interpreted in terms of the cascading effects of policies and events. In short, the Portuguese story suggests greater use of capital plays a greater role in reducing child labor than laws. Shifting to the present, the second essay studies the pattern of child labor in present-day Portugal. Notwithstanding the decline, as mentioned earlier, by 2001 about 8 to 12% of Portuguese children worked. The essay examines whether child work is detrimental, and in particular, examines the effect of child labor on school success. A relative novelty is that the essay distinguishes between different types of child labor, that is, economic and domestic child labor. While evidence on the effects of different types of labor and or the intensity of labor on human capital accumulation is scarce, distinguishing between labor types is important from a policy perspective. In addition, The empirical work in the essay is able to include controls for typically unobserved attributes, such as child's interest in school and educational ambitions, and uses instrumental variable estimation to address the simultaneous determination of school success and child labor. Geographical variation in both policies designed to tackle child labor and labor inspection regimes are used to instrument child labor. I find that the two types of labor have different effects. While even 1 hour of economic work hinders educational success, domestic work does not appear to be harmful. According to my estimates, economic work may be responsible for about 15% of the educational success gap between working and non-working children. Most economic work in Portugal is in the form of unpaid, non-creative, non-entrepreneurial family work in regions with small and medium firms, aiming at survival, and is carried out in families with low educational levels. Therefore, the motivation for work is driven by economic and cultural reasons, with the reproduction of a certain type of livelihood. In these rural and peri-urban contexts, schooling is still less valued by children, parents, and the environment. For instance, see the example of this father's statement. In this context, the competition between school and work for children's time is real, and therefore it is important to treat child labor and schooling as endogenous. Perhaps more importantly, the research findings show that after controlling for a host of relevant socioeconomic variables, factors such as child's interest in school and educational ambitions appear to have a direct and large effect on boosting educational success and reducing economic work. Particularly on educational success, the role of these non-cognitive skills seems far more important than any other factors. This aspect takes me to the third essay. The third essay focuses on the determinants of present-day school outcomes and on the role of a child's interest in school in determining such outcomes. The essay draws inspiration from the differential emphasis of the educational economics and the educational psychology literature. While the educational economics literature emphasizes the role of educational inputs and controls for a wide variety of child, family, and community factors, which may influence cognitive outcomes, it tends to ignore the effect of child, parent, and teacher interests and motivation in shaping outcomes. On the other hand, the educational psychology literature places the role of constructs such as motivation and interest in influencing school achievement at the center stage, but does not account for the role of other influences. The essay uses cross-section and panel data to explore the school interest, the school success relationship. Benefiting from an unusual data set, the essay examines whether a child's interest in school, a non-cognitive attribute, has any bearing on educational success after controlling for a wide range of individual, family, and school characteristics. Although data limitations prevent a causal analysis, estimates suggest that children with a high level of interest in school in '98 are less likely to fail by 2001, as compared to those who had medium and low levels of interest. The research findings show the importance of non-cognitive traits in determining children's educational outcomes. Inferring from the existing literature, these results also suggest that not only do non-cognitive traits have a direct bearing on labor market outcomes, but they also have an indirect bearing through their role in shaping cognitive outcomes. The findings support the increasing number of programs that aim at bolstering students' interest in school with a view to improving school outcomes. Nevertheless, additional research is required to shed light on the mechanisms and strategies for improving interest in school. To conclude my presentation, I would like to add that by researching the Portuguese case on topics such as child labor or schooling, this thesis contributes to break the aspect of developing countries dichotomy present in current literature, and instead promotes a research driven towards a more continuous development spectrum. Childhood and the roles attributed to children have changed dramatically in Portugal in the last 60 years. Children have progressively moved from the fields to the classrooms. Today, even children at risk of dropping out have on average far outperformed their parents. Nevertheless, European countries have also improved their schooling and increased the bar. The nature of schooling standards, with constantly increasing goals, stresses the need for countries to permanently increase their targets. My thesis finds that certain economic activities performed by children seem to compete with school and should be avoided. Boosting non-cognitive skills, such as interest in school, seems to be a promising way forward to boost school outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Candidate, for your presentation. We will now start the examination of your thesis. And I call upon your first external examiner, Professor